great-granddaughter of newspapermen. In 1918, my great-grandfather bought the Louisville Courier-Journal. He believed journalism was a public service, and he ran the paper as a public trust, a tradition that was passed to my grandfather and then my father. When I was 17, I interned at the family papers, and I fell in love with the idea of covering international stories as a photojournalist, for which there isn't really a career path, but mine started in Rwanda. A story was unfolding about the forced closing of some refugee camps, and as my first story that might involve violence, I had no idea what to expect, and honestly, I was terrified. A friend introduced me to some photographers and journalists with real experience, and they took me under wing, and I stuck around to learn from them. I took this photograph on Christmas Day, 1994. A UN team had lined these skulls up at a massacre site, and I learned that that's how you count the dead, when not a single body is left in one piece. It was a vivid lesson on the brutality that we can visit on one another. But during that trip to Rwanda, I knew I'd found my calling. It was the beginning of a decade when I traveled mostly to war zones: Rwanda, Burundi, Zaire, Chiapas, Russia, Sierra Leone, Sudan, Afghanistan, Gaza, and Iraq. As I gained experience, often closer to gunfire than I ever would admit to my family, I learned that my photographs could connect people who would never witness these things firsthand with the mothers and daughters, the fathers and sons whose lives were being overturned. These were not headlines. These were people. And people that I found I had a lot more in common with than I expected. Before every trip, I told myself, if you don't like it, you can always leave. And that worked for me until one time when it didn't. In 2003, days before the invasion of Iraq, I headed to Baghdad. Dozens of journalists were embedded with US soldiers, and I thought that it was important to also report on the stories and experiences of the Iraqi people. In the wee hours of March 25th, I was surrounded in the hotel lobby by several Iraqi men. Some of them were members of Saddam Hussein's highly feared Mukhabarat, the Iraqi intelligence. They insisted at gunpoint that I leave the hotel with them. And along with 3 other journalists and a peace activist, I was driven to a walled compound outside Baghdad. It was Abu Ghraib. I was stripped of my possessions, given a prison uniform, and put in solitary confinement. My country was invading theirs. The Iraqis were accusing me of being a spy, and I thought, you know, this may not end well. The next morning, I was blindfolded and taken by myself from 2 men. My heart was beating so viciously. I thought, what if they make me kneel? What if I feel a gun to my head? How am I going to survive this? Only able to see my feet, I was led along a network of concrete paths and into a carpeted room. It is amazing how, in these desperate moments, your mind looks for any shred of hope. I remember thinking, oh, they won't kill me here. It would make a mess on the carpet. I was blindfolded and taken 5 or 6 more times, each time to discover anew that it was not for execution, but interrogation. My advice, avoid these situations if you can. They are not fun. But in my cell alone, I practiced the answers to questions that I expected. But the hardest questions were really the ones that I asked myself. If you die here, is it worth it? Does this mean that much to you? Journalism? Really? Eventually, my interrogator decided I wasn't a spy, and after 8 days, the 5 of us were released. And over time, the visceral experience of that week has faded, but the questions that I asked myself have always remained. In 2001, I was headed into eastern Zaire's deepest jungle to do a story on these guys, the Mai Mai, and I spent a few days in Butembo. An enterprising businessman there had just activated the first cell tower, and watching mobile phones change the rhythm of that town overnight was like watching tomorrow being born. 11 years later, the world has 6 billion mobile subscribers, connected by devices we carry in our hands, and with more gaining access every day. We can simultaneously reach everyone, everywhere. That isn't just incredible, it also creates the largest market in the history of journalism. And here's why. Journalism's audience has always been a function of available technology. A newspaper circulation was determined by how far a carriage could travel between the time the presses stopped and 7 a.m. Radio and TV broadcasts also had a limited range, and because that reach was limited, stories have always been framed by a parochial perspective. Today is the first time in history where journalism's reach is truly unfettered. But here's the irony. While technology, the medium, has connected us and expanded our reach, the message, our content, has remained stubbornly fragmented and parochial. Even the journalism organizations with a global reach, the Al Jazeeras, the BBCs, the New York Times, their content is still shaped by their community of origin. Even when they tell a global story, they look at it through their local lens. In the blizzard of breaking news and the deluge of opinion and content we're faced with every day, it's really hard to piece those fragments together and feel like we're getting the whole story. It actually reminds me of this wonderful old Hindu fable about the elephant and 6 blind men. Each man is led to a different part of the elephant and asked to describe what he perceives. The first man, touching the trunk, thinks it's a tree. Another man, touching the side, describes a wall. Each man only perceives the part of the elephant that he's led to, and they're doing their best to understand, but they're missing something important, right? I mean, they're missing the elephant. When Ted Turner was asked why he started CNN, he said that technology had made it possible for us to have 24-hour news, and he assumed that the networks would seize that opportunity. But when none of them stepped up, he did. Today, we're reliving that Ted Turner moment, except this time it isn't about 24/7 content, it's about content designed for a diverse global audience. It's about telling stories that are relevant to all 7 billion of us. It's about describing that whole elephant. But it is also an opportunity to develop a new kind of journalism. Journalism where our human community, rather than our national, religious, or ideological community, is our lens on the world. Journalism that fosters the difficult conversations about our common challenges, regardless of who we are or where we're from. I recognize that not everybody has a photo album like mine, but in my experience, for all our differences, we share a core that so profoundly outweighs them. Every single one of us needs food, water, and shelter. We want education for our kids, decent medical care when we're sick, and an honest job to support our families. And we all seek to live knowing dignity and justice. Today, we live in an interdependent and interconnected world, in a time when shoes bought here in Dallas might be sewn together by children in Asia, when a sneeze in a New York airport can make somebody getting off a plane in Moscow sick, and when smog rising from factory pretty much anywhere can eventually make islands in the South Pacific disappear. That's the larger picture, the whole elephant. And it's time we had journalism that ties it all together for us. There is really great journalism to be done by zooming in, even all the way to the hyper-local level. But when we pull that lens back, there is something to see, and it is valuable and important. Rather than a series of random or disconnected events, we can better recognize our world as a set of interlocking systems. We can more readily recognize our common humanity and our common stake in the future. I'm working to develop this new kind of journalism, and I call it ORBmedia. As a nonprofit organization, it will fuse the best traditions and standards of public service journalism with the reach and tools of the digital revolution. Every day, we will produce a single story on one of 8 topics that affect people everywhere: food, water, energy, health, education, environment, trade, and governance. And tapping into the new tools of the digital era, we will integrate and analyze data from governments, international organizations, and academic institutions, identifying worldwide trends and turning the knowledge locked in those spreadsheets back into stories that affect all of us. And our content will be universally accessible, distributed in multimedia, text, and audio, in multiple languages, and on the world's most widely used devices. But it has to also be culturally accessible, committed to understanding us, not just as an aggregate of communities, but really as a single whole. And that's no small thing. Every single one of us is raised to see the world through a specific set of national, religious, and cultural biases determined really purely by where we were born. For us to achieve our global perspective, ORBmedia journalists must be able to remove those blinders, see us as equals, and embrace that wider view of the world. For all the journalists who've gone before us, we are the first generation that can truly say we can reach everyone almost everywhere. And to me, it seems the most natural thing in the world to combine these digital tools with access to a huge audience to tell the biggest story of all time. How are we, the 7 billion people on this planet, collectively faring? It's always taken time for journalism to discover the full power of each new medium. My great-grandfather bought a newspaper and started a radio station. My grandfather ran both and started a television station. And my father was experimenting with digital access to the newspapers when they were sold in 1986. All three of them used the new medium of their era to reach a wider audience and better serve it by raising the difficult issues of their time, whether it was agricultural reform, civil rights, or busing. It's time for us to raise the difficult issues and have the difficult conversations on a global scale. Our greatest challenges are ones we can't solve alone. They don't respect national boundaries or ideological differences. Neither can our solutions, and neither can our conversations. When I was in Abu Ghraib, I came face to face with the ultimate test of my commitment to journalism. And that commitment has only deepened and matured. I believe journalism can be so much more than we're settling for today. It can do so much more than we're asking of it today. In his search for justice and peace, Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "Our loyalties need to transcend our race, our tribe, our class, and our nation. And that means that we need to develop a world perspective." Together, let's rethink journalism and even really what it can do. So tomorrow, I want you to do me a favor. Read whatever the main story of the day. Read it all the way through. And when you're finished, take a minute and just consider, what did you get? And also take a minute to think about what you didn't get. And how, if journalism was truly fostering a global conversation, how that experience might have been just a little bit different. Thank you.